This video contains spoilers for all of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Best here is a little awkward. I don't think this episode is the best the show has to offer in any single category. The fights are fun, but have nothing on other episodes. The dialogue and writing is solid, though again they won't stand out in a series that regularly achieved more than you'd expect a kids show to be able to, and the art and direction won't blow you away either. It's even more awkward here because it's an episode that doesn't feature the protagonist in Aang at all. But that's what does stand out, and it's why I'll call it the best episode the series has to offer, even though it's not my favourite in the show. It's an episode that does more than any other to explore the complexity of Avatar's world in a way that might have alienated its young audience, while still keeping it at a level where they could follow along. Handled differently, this might have been a bleak, depressing episode, or one that buried the emotional core of its narrative under the trappings of a show that wasn't aimed at the people that would most appreciate it. I call it the best because it walked the tightrope between adult themes, no, not that kind, and kid-friendly content better than any other. This is Zuko Alone. In Zuko Alone, Zuko is, unsurprisingly, alone. He has just left his uncle and father figure behind in a search for both the Avatar and a sense of identity. He's a bit lost. Physically, yes, but more so mentally and emotionally, without the one person who always had his back, apart from his absent mother. He has lost his way, but not his pride or sense of honour, and that's reinforced by the opening scene. Starving and exhausted, he considers robbing a man for his food, before he notices the pregnant woman travelling with him. The keen-eyed among you will recognise this travelling couple later appears in the Serpent's Pass, a nice little detail in a series packed with them. This is who Zuko is. He's taking a hard path for the wrong reasons and without the support he absolutely needs. And it's important you keep this in mind as he comes to Lee's farm after refusing to rat him out to the soldiers Lee was hassling. He's offered food and shelter, both of which he really needs, but he refuses.
Supper's going to be ready soon. Would you like to stay?
I can't. I should be moving on.
Gonsu could use some help on the barn. Why don't you two work for a while, and then we'll eat?
He hates the idea of charity, even though he needs it, only accepting it in return for his service, no matter how bad his service is. It's a twisted sense of honour, perhaps, where robbing another traveller is more acceptable than accepting help from strangers. But that's Zuko, struggling to do the right thing in his own way. To that end, throughout this episode, we see flashbacks to Zuko's past that give us glimpses of a pretty complicated childhood, to say the least. A naturally gifted, cruel sister, a cold, perhaps even murderous father, and a mother whose support doesn't make up for the absence and cruelty of his father, makes it easy to see what made Zuko who he is. If this is a story about Zuko finding or perhaps accepting himself, it's also about realizing how foolish labels and factions are. At the close of the episode, Zuko rescues Lee from the soldiers harassing him and his family, revealing his identity in the process. Suddenly, his actions don't matter, only who he is does. Just as the Earth Kingdom soldiers aren't portrayed as good guys next to the Fire Nation's bad guys, Zuko isn't portrayed as a bad guy to the people of this town. Property damage aside, he seems to help them by putting the soldiers in their place, and his help as it was asked for achieved what Lee's mother wanted it to. But it doesn't matter. He's Fire Nation. He's bad. We know that's reductive and outright wrong, but the prejudice that can make people blind to even the best of intentions is one we certainly see in the real world, and an unfortunate aspect of life that few shows aimed at children would choose to point out. So Zuko leaves as he arrived, alone. He did all the right things, but was met with an audience that didn't care. Doing your best isn't always enough, and messages like this, ones you almost never see in shows like this, are what makes Avatar special. Actually, on that note, I think I have to change my mind. Yes, Zuko Alone is a great episode, but the best? I think there's an episode that carries a far darker message than Zuko Alone, while still keeping it kid-friendly. This is the Southern Air Temple. In the Southern Air Temple, Aang learns of the fate of almost everyone he's ever known or loved. They're all dead at the hands of the Fire Nation. If that sounds too heavy for a kids show, you're right. I doubt most kids will pick up that this was genocide, that an entire people were wiped out. The show rather cleverly makes it about Aang learning of the death of his mentor and friend, Monk Gyatso, instead of the crushing realization that his entire people have been killed. It cleverly avoids directly facing the horrors of genocide, but without avoiding how awful realizing what had happened was to Aang. Aang is a kid with a mastery over his emotions that most adults will never achieve. I would say he's wise beyond his years, but he's technically 112, so perhaps he's appropriately wise for his age. Who knows?
I sense he's filled with much wisdom.
See? Now I saw stuff like that.
But even only 3 episodes in, it's already established that despite his goofy attitude, he has a lot more going on under the surface. He's still a kid, and still prone to all of the pitfalls that people his age fall into, but he has mastered his emotions without suppressing them in ways few people can. Frankly, I'm jealous. Even as a kid, Aang is pretty close to who I want to be as an adult. In the Southern Air Temple though, Aang isn't so steady. At the opening of the episode, he seems unable to imagine the changes he's told to expect, sure and insistent that his people will be there to greet him. Returning to his home to find it empty is the first moment we see a bit of sadness and perhaps fear from Aang. Flanked on either side by his new family, he looks small and alone. Wind pulls at his clothes in a bit of foreshadowing, his face turned from the audience. Normally open and welcoming, this is, almost literally, a side of Aang we haven't seen. But we only see it for a moment, before Sokka, in a role he fills throughout the whole series, cheers him up, challenging him into a game he can't win. Moments later, it's Katara who hides the reality of what happened 100 years ago from Aang, while Sokka wants him to face it.
You know, you can't protect him forever.
I think this is one of those clever moments that makes ATLA special. Both want what's best for Aang. Both care about him, despite what Sokka might say about it, but they don't agree on what would be best for him. This is ATLA at its best. Good people with good intentions that don't agree or even outright disagree. I think of moments like Aang discovering Zuko as the Blue Spirit and lamenting that they can't be friends, or when Aang commends Katara for forgiving the man who killed her mother,
But I didn't
and she
forgive
answers
him.
that she hasn't.
I'll never forgive him.
Moments like these are what keeps me coming back to the series. These moments where there isn't one answer to any given question, but rather multiple.
You were right about what Katara needed. Violence wasn't the answer.
It never is.
Then I have a question for you. What are you gonna do when you face my father?
Skipping ahead past a major character introduction as well as an excellent fight sequence that remains one of my favourites from the show, we come to the moment where Aang learns how Gyatso died. This scene is a lot. It's the first proper introduction to the Avatar state, it's a moment where Aang loses control over himself, which crops up as a major fear for him thereafter, and it's the moment Aang, Katara and Sokka are cemented as a group when Katara and Sokka talk him down. We'd all be lucky to have friends like these. That said, close friendships are hardly the most interesting of relationships. When I think of the characters of Avatar, I think complicated is a fair description. So once again, I think I have to change my mind. This is the Day of Black Sun, Part 2. Here, Aang and Co are in the midst of an assault on the Fire Lord's palace, and after finding his secret bunker, they find not the Fire Lord, but rather Azula. Frankly, though filled with some solid action sequences, this part of the episode isn't anything special. What is interesting is Zuko's confrontation with his father. This is a complicated relationship, a son who has always tried to please a father who couldn't be pleased, and a father who mistakes obedience for respect.
All I wanted was for you to love me, to accept me. I thought it was my honor that I wanted, but really, I was just trying to please you. You, my father, who banished me just for talking out of turn. My father, who challenged me, a 13-year-old boy, to an Agni Kai. How can you possibly justify a duel with a child?
It was to teach you respect.
It's here, finally, after what I think is the best character arc in any show ever aired, aimed at kids or no, Zuko finally becomes who he was supposed to be. All of the flashes of decency, the mistakes he's made, and the path he thought he had to follow fall away as Zuko finally restores the honor his father never could. It's a moment the whole series has been building to, and where Aang defeating the Fire Lord was pretty much a given, Zuko didn't always do the right thing when he was tested, which ultimately made this moment all the more satisfying. But on that note, I think I have to change my mind one final time. This still isn't the best episode of ATLA. This is Avatar: The Last Airbender. What made the conclusion to Zuko's arc so satisfying wasn't the conclusion itself. What makes the Southern Air Temple so good isn't just what happens in that episode, and what I love in Zuko Alone reaches far beyond Zuko Alone. Avatar: The Last Airbender makes a whole far greater than its constituent parts, and in my eyes can only be viewed as that whole. To pick a best episode is to ignore the surrounding episodes that made it special. Zuko Alone is so much better for the glimpses of Zuko's story we've seen in previous episodes, and as a setup for future standout moments. So too is the Southern Air Temple, which adds a tremendous amount of weight to both the Storm and the Avatar State episodes, the latter of which specifically deals with the anxiety that nearly hurting his friends at the Southern Air Temple gave him. Finally, the Day of Black Sun, Part 2, only delivers on such a satisfying moment because of all the struggle we've seen Zuko go through, particularly in the crossroads of destiny in which Zuko makes all the wrong choices that he makes up for here. No episode stands alone. The Day of Black Sun, Part 2, wonderfully sets up perhaps the best fight in the series between Zuko, with a newfound sense of purpose and direction that comes from within rather than from his father, and Azula, who has been given everything she always wanted, but finds it meaningless and terrifying without the external validation she took for granted from her friends and father. The Southern Air Temple sets up the fear and anxiety Aang has in the Avatar state, and Zuko Alone sets up the fantastic conclusion to the chase. What I love about ATLA is the whole. It's Zuko's redemptive arc wherein all of his failures are just as important as his eventual success. It's all of the darker moments, and the goofy ones too. It's every part combined, even those I might not love quite as much, that has made the series such a comfort for me. I've had a bit of a rough time recently, and as I often have, I turned to Avatar: The Last Airbender to bring tears to my eyes and a smile to my mouth when little else could. I may have a favourite episode. There may be moments that touch me more than others, and scenes that feel more important than others. But I don't think there's a best episode to be found in a series that as a whole is absolutely peerless. Huge thanks to my patrons at patreon.com/varioushorses. Patrons receive early access to videos, behind the scenes information, and access to occasional pieces of original music, including the original track used in this video. Without their support, I couldn't spend the time I do making these videos. As always, cheers. Have a good one.